I had already reached the elevator when I heard the nurse say my husband's name. Not loud, not careless. Just a whisper, the kind people use when they think grief has made you deaf. "She still doesn't know," one woman said. The other one answered, "If she finds out what Dr. Bennett signed tonight, this whole hospital could be in trouble." My hand was on the elevator button. My coat sleeve was damp from wiping my face. I had just said goodbye to Richard Collins, my husband of 50 years, the man whose hand had fit inside mine since 1973. I had kissed his forehead, told him I would see him in the morning, and walked out of room 814 believing I was leaving him in God's hands. But when I heard those nurses whispering, something inside me went still. Not calm. Still. Like the moment before a storm tears the shingles off your roof. I turned my head just enough to see them standing near the medication room. One was young, with tired eyes and pink sneakers. The other was older, gray, threaded through her dark hair, holding a clipboard tight against her chest. "Lower your voice," the older one murmured. "I'm just saying," the younger nurse replied. "That form wasn't right. He couldn't have." The elevator dinged. Both nurses looked up. I stepped back from the doors before they opened all the way. The younger one saw me first. Her face changed in a way I will never forget. It was not guilt exactly. It was fear. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "I thought you left." "So did I answered. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too dry for a woman who had been crying 10 minutes before. The older nurse forced a gentle smile. "You should go home and rest. It's been a very long day." "Yes," I said, "it has." I did not ask what they meant. Not then. At 68 years old, you learn there is a time for questions and a time for silence. Richard had taught history for 36 years, and he always said the truth rarely runs away if you give it room to reveal itself. So I smiled like an exhausted widow in waiting. Then I walked past the elevator, turned left, and went straight into the visitor restroom. I locked myself in the last stall, sat down fully dressed on the closed toilet lid, and pressed my shaking hands against my knees. "Dr. Bennett signed tonight." "She still doesn't know." "That form wasn't right." Those words circled in my head like buzzards. Until that night, I had trusted St. Anselm Medical Center the way people of my generation were raised to trust hospitals. Doctors wore white coats. Nurses knew best. Families stepped aside when professionals came in. You prayed, nodded, signed where they told you, and thanked everybody even when your heart was breaking. Richard had been admitted 5 days earlier after what we thought was pneumonia. He had been weak for months, but he was stubborn. He still insisted on walking down our driveway in cold weather to bring in the newspaper, even though I kept telling him the news would survive another 10 minutes. "Margaret," he would say, folding the paper under his arm, "a man ought to stay useful as long as he can." That was Richard. Useful, honest, quietly proud. We met at a church picnic in Ohio when I was 19 and he was 21. He spilled lemonade on my blue dress and apologized like he had committed a felony. 2 years later, he proposed to me on a wooden bench outside a public library because he said libraries were where people went to build futures. We raised 2 children in a modest ranch house with a leaky basement and a maple tree that turned gold every October. We were not rich, never close. Richard taught high school history. I worked part-time at the county clerk's office, then full-time after the children were grown. We clipped coupons, drove cars until the doors squeaked, and took one vacation every 4 or 5 years if nothing broke first. But I never went to sleep wondering whether my husband loved me. Even in the hospital with tubes in his arm and oxygen under his nose, Richard still tried to comfort me. "Don't make that face, Maggie," he whispered the first night. "You look like somebody stole your pie at the church supper." I laughed because he needed me to. By the 4th day, he was slipping in and out of consciousness. Dr. Bennett, his attending physician, told me Richard's lungs were failing faster than expected. He used soft words, careful words, words that sounded practiced. "We're doing everything appropriate," he said. Appropriate. At the time, I thought it meant merciful. Now, sitting in that restroom with fluorescent lights buzzing above me, I wondered if it meant something else. When I came out, the hallway had changed shifts. Night had settled over the hospital. Machines beeped behind closed doors. A television murmured from one room. Somewhere, a man coughed a deep, rattling cough that made me think of Richard. I walked back toward room 814, but I stopped at the nurse's station. Richard's chart had been there earlier in the evening, tucked in a plastic holder beside the computer monitor. I remembered because the corner had been bent, and I had almost smoothed it down out of habit. Now it was gone. The young nurse in pink sneakers looked up from her screen. Her name badge said Kelsey. "Mrs. Collins," she said too quickly. "Do you need something?" I was just wondering where my husband's chart went. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. "Oh, everything is electronic now." "I understand that," I said, "but there was a paper file right there earlier." She glanced toward the hallway behind her. Before she could answer, another nurse appeared, the older one from the whispering conversation. Her name was Denise. "Mrs. Collins," Denise said, stepping between me and the desk with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Paperwork gets moved all the time. Nothing for you to worry about." "Then I won't worry," I said. But I looked at Kelsey when I said it. The poor girl swallowed. Denise lowered her voice. "Your husband is comfortable. That's what matters right now." Comfortable. Another word that had begun to feel like a curtain. I thanked them and continued to Richard's room. The room was dim, except for the small lamp near the bed. Richard lay still, his silver hair brushed back from his forehead. His mouth was slightly open, and each breath came with a soft, mechanical sigh from the oxygen machine. I stood beside him and touched his arm. His skin was warm. Richard I whispered something's wrong. Of course he did not answer. I looked around the room slowly, the way I used to search my children's bedrooms when they claimed they had cleaned them. The visitor chair, the rolling tray, the sink, the whiteboard with the date written in blue marker, the medication pump near the bed. That was when I noticed the label on one of the IV bags. I did not understand the medication name, but I knew it had not been there earlier. I had spent enough hours staring at those bags to know when something changed. On the bedside table sat a clipboard. I reached for it. Before my fingers touched the metal clip, the door opened. Dr. Bennett walked in. He was tall, clean-shaven, maybe in his early 50s, with silver glasses, and the tired confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Collins," he said. "I thought you'd gone home." So did everyone, apparently. A flicker crossed his face. Small, but there. "I know this is difficult," he said. "Sometimes families become overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed, doctor, I'm curious." His eyes moved to the clipboard. Then he picked it up before I could. "I'll have the nurse bring you some water," he said. "No, thank you." He held the clipboard at his side. "Your husband's condition is very fragile. The best thing you can do is rest." I looked at Richard, then back at Dr. Bennett. "My husband taught teenagers for 36 years, I said. He could tell when someone was hiding a cigarette, a cheat sheet, or a lie from 40 feet away. Dr. Bennett's polite smile thinned. I stepped closer to Richard's bed and took my husband's hand. I learned from him. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dr. Bennett nodded once and left with the clipboard. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood there listening to Richard breathe. That was the first moment I understood something terrible had entered our lives, something colder than illness and uglier than death. I did not know what form had been signed. I did not know why nurses were whispering. I did not know why my husband's chart had vanished, or why a doctor had just removed paperwork from a dying man's room like it was evidence at a crime scene. But I knew this much. I was not going home. I took the little notebook from my purse, the one where I kept grocery lists, prescription refills, and Richard's doctor appointments. My hand trembled as I opened to a blank page. At the top I wrote, "Room 814, 10:42 p.m. Dr. Bennett took clipboard. Then I sat down beside my husband, folded my coat across my lap, and waited for the hospital to make its next mistake. The first thing I learned about staying awake in a hospital all night was that silence has layers. There was the steady rhythm of machines keeping watch over people who could no longer watch over themselves. There were squeaking shoes in distant hallways, muted conversations behind closed doors, the occasional rattle of a meal cart long after anyone felt hungry. And underneath all of it was something else, a quiet tension I hadn't noticed during the first 4 days Richard had been admitted. Now that I was looking for it, I could feel it everywhere. I checked my watch. 11:18 p.m. Richard hadn't moved since Dr. Bennett left the room with the clipboard. His breathing remained slow and uneven, his chest rising just enough to reassure me he was still here. I reached over and gently straightened the blanket across his shoulder. "You always hated hospitals," I whispered. "Remember when you visited your brother after his knee surgery? You complained more about the cafeteria coffee than he complained about the operation." For just a moment I smiled. That was how grief worked after 50 years together. One memory could make you laugh while the next one broke your heart. The door opened softly. It was Kelsey, the young nurse with the pink sneakers. She carried a small plastic medication cup and avoided looking directly at me. "Time for another dose," she said quietly. I watched as she checked Richard's wristband, then glanced toward the hallway before adjusting the IV pump. "What medication is that?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just part of his comfort care." "What is it called?" Her fingers froze over the buttons. I'd have to look." "You don't know what you're giving him." "I do," she answered quickly. "I mean, I know what it's for." She wasn't lying, but she wasn't telling me everything either. Before I could ask another question, Denise appeared in the doorway. "I'll take over from here," she said. Kelsey looked almost relieved. She quietly left without another word. Denise smiled politely. "Mrs. Collins, why don't you stretch your legs for a little while? We'll be monitoring your husband." "I'd rather stay." "You've been here all day." "So has Richard." The smile disappeared for only a second. "As you wish." She finished adjusting the IV, wrote something on the electronic tablet she carried, and walked away. The room suddenly felt colder. Around midnight, I stepped into the hallway for a cup of coffee. Not because I wanted one, because I wanted to see. The nurses' station was busier now. Shift reports were being exchanged. Several physicians stood discussing charts. I slowed my pace without making it obvious. Richard's paper chart was still missing. Instead, a thin blue folder sat on the counter. One corner stuck out just enough for me to recognize the room number, 814. Before I could get closer, someone picked it up. Dr. Bennett. He tucked the folder beneath his arm and disappeared through a door marked, "Authorized Personnel Only." I memorized the time. 12:07 a.m. Another note went into my little notebook. Richard's room number. Blue folder. Dr. Bennett. Authorized personnel. Every detail mattered now. Richard used to tell his history students that tiny facts often changed entire wars. Maybe tiny facts could uncover smaller battles too. When I returned to room 814, something immediately felt different. Richard's fourth bag had been replaced. I wasn't imagining it. The previous label had been white. This one carried a bright yellow pharmacy sticker. I stepped closer. The medication name meant nothing to me. But the timestamp did. 11:56 p.m. Less than 10 minutes ago. No one had mentioned changing it. I wrote that down too. As I finished, someone knocked gently on the open door. It wasn't a nurse. It was an older man pushing a mop bucket. Gray beard. Blue maintenance uniform. Kind eyes that looked like they had seen too much. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said softly. "Need to clean the hallway." I nodded. As he turned away, he paused. "You've been here every day." "I have." He studied my face for a second. "My wife stayed with me like that." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He glanced toward the nurse's station before lowering his voice. "My name's Samuel." "I'm Margaret." He nodded once. "Mrs. Collins." His eyes drifted toward Richard's room. "Don't let anybody rush you into signing something tonight." My heartbeat stumbled. "What do you mean?" He looked uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't have said anything." "You already did." Samuel sighed. "I've worked here almost 19 years. And I've learned that some families get pushed when they're exhausted." "What kind of paperwork?" "I don't know. But I've seen enough arguments over the years to know something." He leaned slightly closer. "When people suddenly tell you everything needs to happen immediately," he paused. "It usually doesn't." Before I could ask another question, two nurses rounded the corner. Samuel immediately picked up his mop handle. "Have a peaceful night, ma'am." Then he walked away. I watched until he disappeared around the bend. His words stayed behind. "Don't let anybody rush you." At 1:30 in the morning, Richard stirred. His eyelids fluttered. I squeezed his hand. "I'm here." His fingers barely moved. He never fully opened his eyes, but for 2 or 3 seconds I felt him squeeze back. Tears filled mine. "I love you," I whispered. His breathing settled again. I kissed his forehead. Then I noticed something lying half beneath the visitor chair. A folded sheet of paper. It hadn't been there earlier. I bent down and picked it up. It wasn't a medical form. It was a copy. The top half had been torn off. Near the bottom I saw Richard's signature, or what looked like Richard's signature. My stomach tightened. The date read today's date. The time listed was 8:42 p.m. At 8:42 p.m., Richard had barely been conscious enough to whisper my name. He certainly hadn't been signing paperwork. I looked closer. The signature looked almost right. But after 50 years of signing birthday cards, tax returns, Christmas checks, and school permission slips beside him, I knew every curve of Richard's handwriting. The R leaned too far forward. The final S was unnaturally sharp. Someone had copied his name. Not perfectly. Just well enough to fool someone who hadn't loved him for half a century. My hands began shaking. Footsteps approached. Without thinking, I slipped the paper inside my purse. Dr. Bennett entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked pleasantly. "I don't imagine many wives can." He glanced around the room. "Did anyone leave paperwork in here?" "No." His eyes lingered on the floor near the chair, just for a second, looking for something. "I'll have hospice stop by in the morning," he said. "They'll help with the next steps." "The next steps?" He gave me the practiced expression doctors use when they have delivered difficult news too many times. "We want everything to be as smooth as possible." "I appreciate that." He nodded. "Try to get some rest." As soon as he left, I removed the paper again. There wasn't much visible. Most of the document had been torn away. But one sentence remained. Patient consent verified. Verified by whom? Not by Richard. I knew that as surely as I knew my own birthday. I carefully took out my phone. The hospital prohibited photographs of patient information. At that moment, I no longer cared. I photographed the page from 3 different angles. Then I zoomed in on the signature. Footsteps echoed again. I quickly lowered the phone. This time it wasn't Dr. Bennett. It was Kelsey. She stood frozen in the doorway after seeing the paper in my hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "Mrs. Collins." Her voice trembled. "Please keep that somewhere safe." Before I could answer, Denise called her name from the hallway. Kelsey flinched. She hurried away without another word. I looked down at the photograph on my phone, then back at Richard. Whatever secret this hospital was hiding, my husband had somehow become part of it. And for the first time since I walked through those hospital doors 5 days earlier, I stopped thinking like a grieving wife. I started thinking like someone gathering evidence. Morning arrived without sunrise. At least that was how it felt inside St. Anselm Medical Center. The fluorescent lights never changed. The hallways never grew brighter. Time was measured by shift changes, medication rounds, and the sound of coffee being poured into paper cups instead of by the position of the sun. I had not slept. Sometime around 6 o'clock, I washed my face in the visitor restroom, brushed my hair with the small travel brush I kept in my purse, and put on a little lipstick. Richard used to tease me that I could be running a fever, but I'd still insist on looking presentable enough to meet the president. That morning I wasn't trying to look pretty. I was trying to look ordinary. Ordinary people weren't watched as closely. When I returned to room 814, Richard was exactly as I'd left him. His breathing remained shallow but steady. The monitors continued their quiet rhythm. I slipped my hand into his. "Good morning, sweetheart," I whispered. "I think we're in the middle of something neither of us ever expected." His fingers didn't move. But speaking to him made me feel less alone. I reached into my purse and looked again at the photograph of the torn consent form. The signature still bothered me. Not because it resembled Richard's, because it almost did. Whoever had forged it had practiced. That thought chilled me more than the forgery itself. Someone hadn't made a careless mistake. Someone had taken time. Around 8 o'clock, my daughter Laura arrived carrying a paper bag from the bakery near our neighborhood. She hugged me tightly. "You look exhausted." "I am." "I brought you your favorite blueberry muffin." Normally, I would have thanked her and forced myself to eat. Instead, I asked, "Laura, when was the last time you saw your father sign his name?" She frowned. "What?" "Think about it." She set the coffee down. "I don't know, maybe when he renewed the car registration. Did his handwriting look different?" She stared at me. "Mom, what's going on?" I hesitated. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Then I remembered the frightened look on Kelsey's face. I remembered Samuel warning me not to sign anything. If I was wrong, I would only frighten my children for no reason. "If I ask you something," I said carefully, "will you answer honestly without asking questions?" "You know I will." "Yesterday evening, after your father became less responsive, did anyone ask you to sign paperwork?" She shook her head immediately. "No." "No phone calls?" "No." "No emails?" "No." I nodded slowly. That eliminated one possibility. Whatever document had been signed. The hospital hadn't involved our family. Laura squeezed my shoulder. "Mom, I'll explain later." She looked unconvinced, but she knew me well enough not to push. After 20 minutes, she kissed Richard's forehead and left for work, promising to return that evening. As soon as she disappeared down the hallway, I pulled out my notebook again. Laura signed nothing. Another piece of the puzzle. By mid-morning, I realized I needed help. Not from the police. Not yet. From someone who actually understood hospital records. There was only one person I trusted. Helen Morris. Helen and I had met nearly 30 years earlier through our church quilting group. She had spent her career managing medical records at another hospital before retiring 5 years ago. If anyone could tell me whether I was imagining things, it was Helen. She answered on the second ring. Margaret. Helen, I need a favor. Her voice immediately changed. Is Richard worse? I don't know. There was a long pause. Tell me where you are. No. No. If you come here, people may notice. You think someone is watching? I think someone already is. Another silence. Finally, Helen said quietly, Then come to my house. I can't leave Richard. Can you send me photographs? Yes, everything you have, even if it turns out to be nothing, especially then. An hour later, while Richard slept, I sat in the hospital cafeteria pretending to drink coffee. Using the free Wi-Fi, I sent Helen every photograph I'd taken. The torn consent form, the medication labels, the timestamps, the notes from my notebook. I expected she'd call in a few hours. Instead, my phone rang less than 15 minutes later. Margaret. Her voice sounded tighter than usual. What? Where did you get these? Richard's room. Listen to me very carefully. My stomach tightened. I'm listening. The electronic record numbers don't match. I don't understand. They should be sequential. They aren't. No. Helen paused. These entries appear to have been added later. Can that happen? Yes. Legally? No. I gripped the edge of the cafeteria table. What else? The medication documentation isn't following normal protocol. Meaning? The initials belong to different nurses. So the timing overlaps. I still don't understand. You can't be documenting 2 patients in different wings at exactly the same minute. I closed my eyes. Helen continued. And Margaret, yes, the physician authentication time. What about it? It's out of order. I felt cold. What does that mean? It means someone entered information after other entries had already been completed. Could it just be a computer problem? It could. But it usually isn't. I returned upstairs with my heart pounding. Every nurse who smiled at me suddenly looked different. Every conversation stopped sounding friendly. I hated myself for becoming suspicious. Richard had spent his entire life believing the best about people. Now I was wondering who could be trusted. As I entered room 814, I remembered something he had told his students every September. Never confuse patience with weakness. He repeated those words so often our children could quote them. I sat beside him. I don't want to become angry, I whispered. I just want the truth. For several minutes, I simply watched him breathe. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linen. Outside the window, rain had begun tapping against the glass. I thought about all the ordinary days Richard and I had shared. Saturday grocery trips, church dinners, watching baseball even though neither of us cared much who won. The beautiful sameness of 50 years. If someone had truly done something dishonest to this gentle man, I owed him more than tears. I owed him patience and proof. Just after noon, a volunteer delivered flowers addressed to another patient. She accidentally stopped at our room first. I'm sorry, she said, wrong room. As she turned away, something white slipped from beneath the bouquet. An envelope. She didn't notice. I picked it up. There you go, I called. She looked back. Oh, she hurried over, then stopped. No, she looked confused. That's not mine. There was no name on the envelope. No hospital logo. Nothing. Only one handwritten word. Margaret. My pulse quickened. Did someone give this to you? She shook her head. I found the flowers already waiting downstairs. Before I could ask another question, she excused herself and left. I waited until the hallway was empty. Then I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies, hospital documents, patient identification numbers, billing summaries, medication logs. Every page had one thing in common. Dr. Andrew Bennett. His name appeared again, and again, and again. Folded between the papers was a yellow sticky note. 5 words. Richard wasn't the first. No signature. No explanation. Nothing else. I stared at those words until they blurred. Someone inside this hospital knew exactly what was happening. Someone was trying to help me, or trying to use me. I didn't know which frightened me more. I gathered every page, slipped them back into the envelope, and placed it deep inside my purse. Then I opened my notebook one more time. Instead of writing another observation, I wrote a promise. No accusations without evidence. No fear without facts. Keep looking. It sounded exactly like something Richard would have said. And for the first time since overhearing those nurses the night before, I felt that I wasn't chasing shadows anymore. Someone had just confirmed there was a truth hidden inside these walls. The only question left was how dangerous that truth really was. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the rain had turned the hospital windows gray. It came down in steady sheets running across the glass like long fingers. From Richard's room on the 8th floor, I could see the parking lot below, all shiny black pavement and blurred headlights. People hurried in and out beneath umbrellas, living ordinary lives, while mine had narrowed to a hospital bed, a notebook, and an envelope full of documents I was afraid to read twice. Richard's breathing had changed a little. Not worse exactly. Just thinner, like a candle flame shrinking in a room with no wind. I sat beside him with the anonymous papers spread carefully across my lap beneath my coat, pretending to read a magazine whenever someone passed the door. The note kept burning in my mind. Richard wasn't the first. I had already looked through the first 3 pages. They were full of medical language I could barely understand, but I recognized enough to see a pattern. Same floor, same attending physician, same late-night authorizations, same type of consent verification. And there, in tiny print near the bottom of one page, was a name I recognized from the blue folder Dr. Bennett had carried away. Marilyn Hargrove. I didn't know her personally, but I remembered seeing her daughter in the hallway 2 nights earlier. A short woman with red-rimmed eyes and a cardigan buttoned wrong standing at the nurse's station, while Denise spoke to her in that same soft, practiced voice. "She went home crying," I whispered. Richard did not answer. I touched his hand, then placed the papers back in the envelope. Just then my phone buzzed. "Helen." I stepped into the corner of the room, keeping my voice low. "I looked at the new documents," I said. "So did I," Helen replied. "Margaret, this is bigger than your husband." My knees felt weak, so I sat down. "How big?" "I can't say yet, but the billing codes are strange." "Strange how?" "They're using treatment classifications that increase reimbursement. Insurance money." "Yes, and possibly liability protection too, depending on how the outcome is recorded." I closed my eyes. Richard had spent 36 years teaching young people that corruption rarely wore horns. It usually wore a nice suit and carried a clipboard. "What do?" I asked. "Do not confront Bennett. Do not give anyone the envelope, and do not sign anything." I wasn't planning to. "I'm serious," Helen said. "Hospitals have attorneys. You have grief and a purse full of photocopies." "That makes me sound foolish." "No," she said gently. "It makes you vulnerable." The word hurt because it was true. Before I could answer, a man in a navy suit appeared at Richard's door and knocked lightly on the frame. "Mrs. Collins." I turned. He wore a hospital badge clipped to his jacket pocket. His smile had no warmth. "Helen, I have to go." "Margaret." I ended the call. The man stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "My name is Gregory Walsh. I'm with hospital administration." Of course he was. I slid the envelope beneath my coat. "How can I help you, Mr. Walsh?" He glanced at Richard, then back at me. "First, let me say how sorry we are for what your family is going through." "Thank you. We understand this is an emotional time." People kept telling me that. Emotional, overwhelmed, exhausted, as if grief made a woman stupid. He clasped his hands in front of him. "It has come to our attention that you may have concerns about your husband's care." I looked at him calmly. "Who told you that?" His smile tightened. "Staff members mentioned you had been asking questions. Is that unusual?" "Not at all. Families ask questions every day." "Then why are you here?" That stopped him for half a second. He recovered quickly. "We simply want to make sure misinformation doesn't add unnecessary distress." "Misinformation from whom?" "Mrs. Collins," he said, lowering his voice, "in modern healthcare records are complex. It's very easy for someone without medical training to misinterpret documents." I folded my hands in my lap. My husband used to say that whenever powerful people called something complex, they usually hoped ordinary folks would stop looking at it. Mr. Walsh blinked. Then he gave a soft chuckle as though I had said something quaint. "We certainly respect your husband's background as an educator." "Do you?" "Of course." He reached into a leather folder and removed several papers. "We'd like to help simplify the next steps for you. These forms allow us to coordinate comfort care family communication and record access in a more efficient manner." Record access. There it was. "May I read them?" "Certainly." He handed them to me but kept one finger on the top page a moment too long before letting go. I put on my reading glasses slowly. The first page looked harmless. The second had paragraphs of legal language packed close together. On the third page, one sentence caught my eye. I authorize St. Ansel Medical Center to manage all inquiries related to treatment documentation through hospital administration. I looked up. What does this mean? It simply centralizes communication. With you. With our office. So if I ask for records, I ask you. That would be best. Best for whom, I wondered. I handed the papers back. I'll have my attorney review them. Mr. Walsh's face changed. Not much. Just enough. Of course, he said, though involving attorneys at this stage can sometimes create delays. I'm 68, Mr. Walsh. I've learned that some delays are blessings. He stood. I only caution you because unsupported accusations can create consequences. The room seemed to shrink around us. Was that concern, I asked, or a warning? His smile returned thinner than before. Good afternoon, Mrs. Collins. After he left, I sat very still. Not because I was frightened. Because I was furious, and fury at my age needs somewhere useful to go. I opened my notebook and wrote his name. Gregory Walsh. Administration. Tried to get signature. Implied consequences. Then I added one more line. They know I know something. That changed everything. By evening, Laura returned with her older brother, Michael. My son looked pale the moment he saw Richard. He had always been soft-hearted beneath his practical manner, the kind of man who could fix a leaky faucet but still cry at old home movies. Mom, he said quietly, Laura told me you're worried about something. Laura shot me an apologetic look. I couldn't blame her. I led them into the family waiting area and told them only enough. The whispering nurses, the strange form, the forged-looking signature, the administrator. Michael rubbed both hands down his face. Mom, are you sure you're not just exhausted? Laura turned sharply. Michael! No, I mean it kindly, he said. She hasn't slept. I know my husband's signature, I said. He looked ashamed immediately. I'm sorry. I softened. You're scared. So am I. For a moment, we were just a family standing under ugly hospital lights, trying not to break apart before Richard was even gone. Then Laura whispered, What would Dad do? I almost laughed. That was easy. He'd gather facts, quietly. Michael nodded slowly. Then that's what we do. Before we could say more, Kelsey hurried into the waiting area. Her face was white. Mrs. Collins, she said, your husband's awake. I ran. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was in the waiting room, the next I was beside Richard's bed, breathless, gripping his hand. His eyes were barely open, clouded, exhausted. But aware, Richard the First whispered, I'm here. His lips moved. I leaned close. What, sweetheart? His fingers tightened around mine with more strength than he had shown in 2 days. Find. His voice was dry as paper. I bent closer until my ear was almost against his mouth. Find the... He struggled for air. Tears spilled down my cheeks. Don't force it, I said, please. His eyes found mine. For one clear second, my Richard was there. Not the patient, not the dying man, but the teacher who had stood in front of classrooms and told children that truth mattered. File, he breathed. Then his hand went slack. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but he slipped away from consciousness again. I stood frozen. Find the file. Behind me, Laura began to cry softly. Michael whispered, What file? I looked at Richard's nightstand. Then the closet. Then the small plastic bag holding his belongings. His watch. His shoes. His folded sweater. His old leather briefcase. The one I had not touched since the ambulance brought us here. My heart started pounding. Richard had not said goodbye. He had given me instructions, and this time I knew exactly where to look. The briefcase sat in the bottom of the closet like an ordinary thing. Brown leather, scratched at the corners. Brass buckles dulled from years of use. Richard had carried that same briefcase to school for decades. Our children used to joke that it was older than some of his students. He kept attendance sheets in it, history tests, extra pens, cough drops, and once to my great irritation, half a tuna sandwich he forgot about over spring break. Now it looked like a locked chest from another life. Michael reached for it first. Let me, Mom. No, I said. My voice came out sharper than I meant. He stopped immediately. I softened and touched his arm. Your father told me to find the file. Laura wiped her cheeks with a tissue. Mom, you don't have to do this alone. I know. But some duties belong to a wife, not because children love less. Because 50 years of marriage creates a language no one else speaks. I lifted the briefcase onto the visitor chair. My hands trembled as I opened the buckles. Inside were the usual things Richard would never admit he needed. A folded newspaper, a paperback book about the Civil War, 2 granola bars, his reading glasses in a cracked case, and beneath everything tucked into the back pocket was a large yellow envelope sealed with tape. My name was written across the front. Maggie, not Margaret. Maggie. My knees nearly gave out. Laura made a sound behind me, but I couldn't look at her. If I did, I might stop. I sat down and carefully pulled the tape loose. Inside was a stack of papers, a flash drive, and one handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter first. Richard's handwriting slanted across the page, a little shaky but unmistakably his. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, it means I was either too weak or too foolish to tell you everything before now. Knowing me, probably both. I pressed the page against my chest and shut my eyes. Michael whispered, "Mom, I'm all right." I wasn't. But I kept reading. Richard wrote that he had begun noticing strange things during his earlier outpatient visits. Bills arriving with treatment codes he did not recognize. Insurance statements showing procedures he didn't remember receiving. A retired man named Walter Pierce, whom Richard had met in the waiting room, had complained of similar problems. Then Walter died unexpectedly after a sudden transfer to the 8th floor. Richard, being Richard, had started asking questions. Not loudly. Never loudly. He requested copies of records, compared dates, called the insurance company, saved every letter. He even wrote down names of staff members who became nervous when he mentioned billing. Halfway through the letter, the room began to blur. My husband had been investigating St. Anselm before he became too sick to protect himself, and he hadn't told me because he didn't want to worry me. That was so Richard it hurt. At the bottom of the letter he had written, "If something happens and my records don't make sense, trust yourself before you trust their explanations. You always noticed what I missed." I broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically. I simply bent over the letter and cried into my hands while my children stood helpless around me. For years, I had thought love was made of the big vows, weddings, anniversaries, hospital promises, standing beside each other when life turned cruel. But sometimes love is a man hiding evidence in a briefcase because he knows his wife will be brave when he cannot be. After a few minutes, Laura knelt beside me. "What did Dad find?" I handed her the papers. She read silently while Michael paced near the window, jaw tight. "This is fraud," he said finally. "We don't know that yet," I answered. He stared at me. "Mom, we know enough to keep looking. That's different." Richard would have been proud of me for saying that. The flash drive was the most frightening part. Michael borrowed a nurse's charging station long enough to plug it into his laptop. I almost told him not to. Part of me wanted to keep Richard's last gift folded neatly in an envelope, untouched by whatever ugliness waited inside. But truth does not become easier because you postpone it. The drive contained folders, insurance statements, patient notes, emails, Bennett. Michael opened the last one. There were saved screenshots of messages Richard had printed from a patient advocacy portal. Some were short, some were technical, but several showed Richard questioning duplicate charges and unexplained treatment authorizations. One message from a billing supervisor said, "All coding inquiries related to physician-directed care should be referred to administration." Administration. Gregory Walsh. Another document listed names: Walter Pierce, Marilyn Hargrove, Ann Whitcomb, Frank Doyle, and now in Richard's careful handwriting beneath them, pattern. Laura covered her mouth. "He knew." "Yes," I whispered, "he knew." Before we could say more, Helen called. I sent her photographs of Richard's letter and the document list. This time I didn't sit in the cafeteria. I stayed beside my husband, holding his hand while my phone rested on speaker at the lowest volume. Helen's voice was grave. "Margaret, this is no longer something you handle alone. Who do we call?" "I know someone. Her name is Dana Ruiz. She used to investigate healthcare compliance cases for the state. She's private now, but she's honest." "Can she come here?" "Not if you want to avoid attention." I looked at Richard's face. I did not want to leave him. Helen seemed to understand the silence. "I'll send everything to her securely. She can start reviewing tonight." "Tonight?" "Yes, because whoever tried to get you to sign those forms may try again." Michael leaned closer. "Can we call the police?" Helen sighed. "You can, but local police may not understand medical fraud quickly enough to preserve records. First, we need duplicate copies in safe hands." "Then do it," I said. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. After the call ended, I looked at my children. "You both go home." "No," Laura said immediately. "Mom, forget it," Michael added. I shook my head. "Listen to me. I need you rested. I need you thinking clearly. Your father and I raised you to be useful in a crisis, not crowded in a room wearing yourselves down." Michael almost smiled despite everything. "That sounds like Dad. It was probably stolen from him." Laura hugged me long and hard. When they left, the room became quiet again. Richard's breathing had grown more uneven. Every pause felt too long. Every breath felt like a small mercy returned. I sat with him through the evening, reading his letter again and again until the folds softened. Around 9, Dr. Bennett came in. He looked surprised to find me awake, seated upright, composed. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "your husband is declining." "I know. We may need to discuss certain final care authorizations." "Number." He blinked. "Excuse me. I won't sign anything tonight." His expression hardened beneath the professional mask. "These decisions are time-sensitive." "No," I said again, "they are not." For the first time, Dr. Bennett had no smooth answer ready. I placed my hand over Richard's. "My husband is not a billing code doctor. He is not a document, and he is not a problem to be managed." The room went very still. Dr. Bennett looked at me for a long moment. Then he left without another word. I waited until the door closed. Then I leaned down and kissed Richard's temple. "I found it," I whispered. "I found the file." His eyelids fluttered. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. A little after midnight, Richard took one long breath, then another, softer one. I called for the nurse. Kelsey came first. She checked him, then looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. I held Richard's hand as the man I had loved since I was 19 slipped quietly out of this world. There was no thunder, no final speech, only the soft hum of machines and the terrible stillness that follows a life well lived. I laid my forehead against his hand. For a while I was not an investigator. I was only a wife. But when I finally lifted my head, I folded Richard's letter, placed it back in the envelope, and made one last promise to him. "I'll finish what you started." And this time my grief did not weaken me. It gave me something to stand on. Richard's funeral was held on a cold Thursday morning, the kind of morning where the sky looked like old pewter, and every bare tree seemed to be standing at attention. We buried him at Maple Grove Cemetery, 2 miles from the house where we had raised our children. It was a small service, family, church friends, a few former students who were old enough now to have gray hair of their own. One man came up to me after the pastor finished and said, "Mrs. Collins, your husband kept me from dropping out in 1988. Another woman said, "He made me believe I was smarter than I thought." That was Richard's real fortune. Not money, not property, people. I stood beside his casket with Laura on one side and Michael on the other, listening to the words people offered me because they didn't know what else to give. I thanked every one of them. I hugged who needed hugging. I smiled when I could. But inside my purse, beneath a folded handkerchief and a packet of tissues, was Richard's envelope. Even at his funeral, I could feel the weight of it. When the last prayer ended, the crowd slowly drifted toward their cars. Someone from church mentioned bringing casseroles. Someone else offered to drive me home. I was about to answer when a man I did not recognize stepped in front of me. He was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, with a weathered face and cautious eyes. He wore a dark overcoat and held his hat in both hands. "Mrs. Collins." "Yes, my name is Thomas Avery." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "I used to work in compliance at St. Anselm." My body went cold. Laura looked at him sharply. Michael stepped closer. Mr. Avery noticed but did not back away. "I'm sorry for approaching you here," he said. "But I knew your husband had died and I wasn't sure I'd get another chance." "How did you know Richard?" "I didn't, not directly." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a plain business card. "I tried to stop what was happening 5 years ago." The wind moved across the cemetery, lifting the edge of my black scarf. "What happened?" I asked. His mouth tightened. "I lost." Then he placed the card in my hand and walked away before anyone could question him further. On the back of the card, written in blue ink, were 4 words. I still have proof. That afternoon, my house filled with food and sympathy. People meant well, they always do, but grief makes even kindness noisy. There were foil-covered dishes on the kitchen counter, coats on chairs, murmured conversations in the living room, and my sister-in-law asking 3 times whether I wanted her to make coffee. I finally escaped to Richard's study. His reading glasses still lay beside the lamp. His favorite sweater hung over the chair. A yellow sticky note on his desk said, "Buy furnace filters." That undone errand nearly broke me. I sat in his chair, held Thomas Avery's card, and called the number. He answered on the first ring. "I wondered if you would wait," he said. "I'm done waiting." There was a pause. "Good." He asked me to meet him at a diner outside town. Michael insisted on coming. So did Laura. I almost argued, then looked at their faces and realized they were no longer children needing protection from the truth. They were Richard's children, and they deserved a place in this fight. The diner smelled of burnt coffee bacon grease and wet wool coats. Thomas Avery sat in the back booth with a folder beside him. He looked older under the yellow lights. "I worked at St. Anselm for 12 years, he began. My job was to make sure records, billing, and physician documentation followed regulations. And they didn't," Michael said. "Number." Thomas opened the folder. "About 6 years ago, I noticed repeated end-of-life cases with unusual billing patterns. Patients were being moved to certain floors, assigned certain codes, and processed through the same small group of administrators." "Gregory Walsh," I said. Thomas nodded. "And Dr. Bennett? He was part of it, maybe not at the beginning. But later, yes." Laura's voice shook. "Are you saying they killed people?" Thomas looked pained. "I'm saying they created circumstances where vulnerable patients were treated like financial events. Whether any treatment directly caused a death is something investigators would have to prove. That distinction mattered legally. Emotionally, it barely mattered at all." He slid copies across the table. Internal emails, complaint logs, reports he had filed. Warnings ignored. One email from Thomas to administration mentioned possible unauthorized consent verification. Another response signed by Gregory Walsh dismissed the issue as documentation confusion during high-volume care periods. I read that phrase twice. Documentation confusion. Richard would have hated that. Thomas leaned forward. "I resigned after they buried my final report. I should have gone public." "Why didn't you?" Laura asked. He looked down at his hands. "My wife had cancer. I needed insurance. Then she died. By the time I found the courage, I had convinced myself nobody would listen." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins." For a moment, anger rose in me. Sharp, bitter, deserved. But looking at that tired old man across from me, I saw fear, regret. The terrible human habit of surviving first and being brave later. "You're here now," I said. His eyes filled. "Yes, ma'am." With Thomas's documents, Richard's file, Helen's review, and Dana Ruiz's compliance expertise, the case finally became too large to ignore. Dana moved carefully. She did not shout. She did not promise miracles. She made copies, built timelines, verified document trails, and sent formal complaints to the State Health Department Medicare fraud investigators and the hospital board's outside counsel. "Facts first," she told me, "emotion later." Richard would have liked her. Within 2 weeks, St. Anselm began to change. Not publicly at first, quietly. Dr. Bennett took personal leave. Gregory Walsh stopped appearing in the hallways. Denise was reassigned. Kelsey called me one evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You were afraid." "That doesn't excuse it." "No," I said gently. "But telling the truth now still matters." She became one of the first staff witnesses. Samuel, the janitor, gave a statement too. He had kept a notebook of his own for years. Dates, room numbers, families who left crying after late-night paperwork meetings. When Dana read his notes, she whispered, "God bless careful people." 3 months after Richard's death, the official investigation became public. The local news called it a documentation and billing scandal. That sounded too clean to me, like calling a house fire a temperature incident. But families began coming forward. Marilyn Hargrove's daughter called me. So did Walter Pierce's grandson. We were strangers tied together by the same quiet betrayal. The hospital board issued a statement expressing concern, then cooperation, then regret. Statements are strange things. They grow softer as accountability grows harder. Eventually, Dr. Bennett's license was suspended pending review. Gregory Walsh resigned. Several cases were referred for criminal investigation. Insurance auditors began combing through years of records. Was it enough? No justice brings back the dead, but it stopped the machine. And sometimes stopping the machine is the first mercy. On the day St. Anselm formally corrected Richard's record, I drove alone to Maple Grove Cemetery. The grass had begun to turn green at the edges. Spring was trying. I stood beside Richard's grave with the corrected document folded in my hand. "They admitted it," I told him. A breeze moved through the maple branches. "They didn't say it plain, of course. Men like that never do. But it's here." I placed the paper against my chest. "Your name is clear." For the first time since his death, I cried without feeling like I was falling apart. I cried because I missed him. I cried because he had trusted me. And I cried because somewhere between that hospital hallway and this quiet cemetery, I had become exactly the woman he believed I was. Before I left, I touched his headstone. You were right, I whispered. Truth only needed patience. Then I walked back to the car with my shoulders straighter than they had been in months. Justice had not arrived like thunder. It came quietly. One note, one file, one frightened nurse, one grieving widow who refused to sign away the truth. 6 months after Richard died, I stood in the basement of First Presbyterian Church, holding a stack of hospital intake forms in my hands. The same basement where Richard and I had once attended potluck dinners, Christmas pageant rehearsals, retirement parties, and more pancake breakfasts than I could count. Only now the folding tables were covered with clipboards, reading glasses, pens, insurance booklets, and yellow highlighters. A handmade sign taped to the wall read, "Patient Rights Workshop, ask before you sign." I looked at those words and almost smiled. Richard would have corrected the spacing on the sign. He always noticed little things like that. Crooked picture frames, misspelled bulletin announcements, dates written in the wrong order. But I think he would have liked the message. The first workshop had been Helen's idea. "You've learned something painful," she told me. "Don't let it stop with pain." At first I resisted. I was tired. Tired of documents. Tired of phone calls. Tired of hearing strangers say Richard's name in legal conversations. Some mornings, just making coffee for one person felt like climbing a hill with a stone in each hand. But then Marilyn Hargrove's daughter called again. Her name was Beth. She told me she still blamed herself for going home the night her mother died. "I signed everything they handed me," she said. "I didn't even read half of it. I understood that kind of guilt. So I told her what I wished someone had told me. You were a daughter in pain. They were professionals in control. Responsibility does not weigh the same on both sides." She cried. After that call, I knew Helen was right. Pain should teach somebody. So we began with 12 people in the church basement. By spring, we needed extra chairs. Most who came were older folks. Widows, retired couples, adult children caring for parents. People who had Medicare cards tucked carefully in wallets and medication lists folded into purse pockets. I did not pretend to be a lawyer or a nurse. I always made that clear. "I'm just a woman who learned the hard way," I told them. Then I taught what I could. Ask what a form means before signing it. Request copies of everything. Write down names, dates, and times. Take a trusted person with you when decisions are serious. Do not let embarrassment silence you. Do not let a white coat make you forget your common sense. And most of all, never believe that being polite means being passive. One afternoon after a workshop, an elderly man named Carl stayed behind while everyone else gathered cookies and coffee near the back table. He held his wife's discharge papers in both hands. "I feel foolish asking questions," he admitted. His wife, small and bird-boned beside him, touched his sleeve. "We were raised not to question doctors," she said. "So was I told them." Carl looked at me. "And now I still respect good doctors," I said. "But I remember they are human beings, not saints." He nodded slowly, like that sentence had given him permission to breathe. Those were the moments that kept me going. Not revenge. Not headlines. Not even the official investigation, though it continued for months and revealed more than any of us expected. What kept me going was seeing ordinary people straighten their backs. Quietly. Carefully. With dignity. Kelsey came to one of the workshops, too. She stood near the door for almost 10 minutes before coming inside. She wore jeans and a green sweater instead of scrubs, and she looked younger without the hospital badge. When she saw me, her eyes filled. "I wasn't sure I should come." "I'm glad you did." She swallowed. I testified. "I know. They asked why I didn't report it sooner." "What did you say?" "The truth." She wiped her cheek. "That I was scared of losing my job." I nodded. She looked down. "Mrs. Collins, I am so sorry. There are apologies people give to escape guilt, and there are apologies people give because guilt finally taught them courage. Kelsey's was the second kind." I took her hands. "I forgive you," I said. "But I hope you never forget how heavy silence can become." She began to cry then. So did I. Forgiveness did not mean pretending Richard's death hadn't been surrounded by lies. It did not mean excusing cowardice. It meant refusing to let bitterness move into the empty side of my bed and call itself company. That was a lesson I had to learn slowly. For months I still reached for Richard in the morning, still bought his favorite cereal once by accident, still turned to tell him things during television shows. The first time I cleaned out his closet, I sat on the floor with one of his sweaters pressed against my face for almost an hour. Grief does not leave because justice arrives. It simply learns to sit beside you differently. On what would have been our 51st anniversary, I drove to Maple Grove Cemetery with 2 cups of coffee, one black for him, one with cream for me. I sat on the small bench near his grave and told him everything. About the workshops. About Kelsey. About Beth Hargrove bringing lemon bars. About Michael fixing the church projector badly, and Laura teasing him until he admitted he needed directions. Then I told him the truth I had avoided saying out loud. "I'm still angry," I whispered. The wind moved softly through the maple leaves. But I'm not only angry anymore. That mattered. Anger had carried me when grief could not. But Richard had never been a man who wanted to live inside anger. He believed truth should lead somewhere better, even when it had to walk through fire first. I touched the top of his headstone. "You left me a file," I said, "but you also left me a life." And at last I understood. Richard's final gift was not evidence. It was trust. He trusted that I would notice, that I would question, that I would keep my heart soft without letting my mind go blind. That is what love leaves behind when it has been honest for 50 years. Not just memories, a standard, a lantern, a way to keep walking. So, if you are listening to this, and someone you love is sitting in a hospital bed, a nursing home room, a doctor's office, or anywhere they feel too weak to speak for themselves, please remember this old widow's lesson. Be kind, be respectful, but ask questions. Write things down. Read before you sign. Bring another set of eyes. And never let anyone make you feel ashamed for protecting someone who cannot protect themselves. If Richard's story has touched your heart, share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you believe quiet truth still matters in this noisy world, stay with us for more stories about courage, dignity, and the strength ordinary people find when life gives them no choice but to stand up.